that button. Ooh. One of the things that I've been trying to do over the last few months is to help us understand the concept of Christian love, because it's such a difficult thing to understand, to actually practice in our lives. The kind of love that Jesus had for us. Who does such a thing that he did for somebody that hates him? That is such a hard thing to wrap your brain around. I can understand doing something for somebody that you love or loves you back, but how do you treat someone who is doing their best to destroy you? How do you treat them the same way that you treat somebody that does you very good, that does only good things to you? And the Lord talked about that when he was talking about the Pharisees and those. He says, if you do good to those who do good back to you, you're no better than the sinners, because they do the same thing. They treat people well who treat them well. It's paying it back. But the concept of paying it forward, or the concept of forgiveness, we've talked about that word, how forgiveness is not really aftergiveness, which is the way we most often look at it. Forgiveness has to do with planning and making sure that what you do in any set of circumstances is the best for the other person, the best for whoever it is that is the object of your love. So when we look at the plan of salvation, when we understand exactly what happened, I want to talk about this concept of joy or bitterness. The choice is ours. There was something that happened at creation or before creation. That is, that during that discussion that deity had about bringing us into existence, the statement in Genesis 1:26 where they said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." There is so much behind that we don't really picture just by reading that verse. But think about this now. When they were planning to bring us into existence, there was so much that had to be planned for. When parents decide to have children, when you start developing this concept of having a family and you want to bring other living beings into your circle, you want to have everything set up just right so that everything will go the way it's supposed to go. So when God, who is a pretty good planner, you stop and think about it, all these interactive systems that we have, all of these synergistic, cooperative relationships that there are in the world, and God planned for all of those. Think about what it was like to plan to bring human beings in this world that were both physical and flesh, but also on the other side were part of God, spirit that is just like God, spirit that actually comes from God. So you could actually say it's a piece of God. And to bring those children into the world, and he refers to us as his children, and to not think that they're going to make mistakes, that's impossible. With God's foresight, with God's ability to see into the future, to not know that we were going to mess up, it's just, that's ludicrous. So think about this. All of the forgiveness that we have in Christ Jesus had to be planned and provisions made for way in advance of even making us and putting us in this world. Now, we're told in Hebrews chapter 12 that right after the chapter that describes all of these great men of faith that have done all that they've done in believing in God, trusting in God, then it gets down to where it says, talking about Jesus, it says, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and he did all that he did because he was able to do it for the joy set before him. Now, I want you to think about this with me. Because all of his life, all of his physical life, he was beset by people that did not believe he was who he claimed to be. Everything that he did was in opposition to the majority of the world. Everybody, it seems, wanted to put him to death. Very few people actually trusted him, actually loved him, actually wanted to follow him. It says in John 1, he came unto his own, and his own people, actually his own creation, did not accept him, did not receive him. But then it says, but those who received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. There was a choice to be made. Were we going to follow? Or were we going to be like the majority of the world that rejected him and didn't want anything to do with him? But go back. I want to turn now, if we can. I want us to go to that passage in Hebrews, and I want us to think about what was said there. In this passage in chapter 12, let's begin in verse 1. It says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, and that refers back to chapter 11 with all that great list of people where the writer of Hebrews finally says, if I go on, there won't be any time for me to tell you of all of these people. And then he says, therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses, like there's a huge stadium, and all of these people who have already gone through all of this are sitting in this stadium watching us go through whatever it is we're going through. He says, since we have this great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance. There are things that keep us from having the joy that we could have and turn us toward bitterness. That passage in Hebrews warns us that bitterness, the root of bitterness, can destroy everything that God created for us. So we have to be aware of that. Recognize that bitterness can take place if we don't handle things the way we're supposed to handle them. It happens with friends, it happens with families, it happens with parents and children. It happens everywhere you look, that relationships are destroyed because of bitterness. Now, if you want to talk about somebody who had a right to be bitter, try thinking about the Lord Jesus and what he knew he was going to have to go through in order to save us from ourselves. It wasn't him who caused it, it was us. In Ephesians chapter 4, it says the people who wind up being worldly and doing the wrong thing, he said, you did not learn Christ in that way. We didn't learn it from Jesus. It's not his fault that we turn away from God. So recognize that what it says here, it says, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And here's how we do it. Here's how we do it. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. And then it tells us how he did it. It says, who for the joy set before him. The joy set before him. What joy is there in having people reject you? What parent likes to have their children spit in their face? That happened to him. What parent has any joy in their children beating on them? It happened to him. What parent has any kind of joy in having their children say, "You've never done anything for me"? But it happened to him. What joy, those Menendez brothers in California that shot both of their parents. Of course, you don't have a chance to be joyful after you've been killed, but what joy would there be if you even knew that the children were going to attempt to kill you for money? Or I don't know why they killed them. But that's the kind of thing that turns people bitter. Whenever something's done against you and you cannot see joy anywhere, it turns us bitter. This lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. That's something that we need to examine a little bit. I want to go to the book of Ephesians in chapter 4, where we were talking about in class this morning for a bit. But I want to look at something here that I want to talk about just a little bit, because it has a lot to do with what we're thinking about. I want to back up to verse 17. Here's where we are when we start even thinking about turning to God. Paul writes this to this church, and I think this was probably a circular letter that was sent to a lot of different churches, and we wound up getting the one we have the one that was addressed to Ephesus. But I think this went to all of the churches of the day. Paul writes this, he says, this I say, and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind. There are ways that we can think that are just plumb futile. I mean, they won't get us anywhere in life. He says, I don't want you to think like the Gentiles think, in the futility of their mind. He says, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. But he even explains why they're ignorant. He says, because of the hardness of their heart. He says, and they, having become callous, that's what happens when we keep violating our conscience. I think the first sermon I ever gave when I was 14 years old. It's funny that I can remember something about that, but I was trying to describe what a conscience was. And I described it as a little triangle in your head that when it turns, it hurts. The sharp edges on that triangle hurt when it turns. But if you keep turning it enough, it either wears the points off or you get callous to it and it doesn't hurt anymore. Well, that's what this is talking about. They have become callous. They're no longer hurt by their conscience. It says, have given themselves over to sensuality, for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. Not just doing it, but greedy about doing it. And then he says this. He says, but you did not learn Christ in this way. We didn't learn that from Jesus. He says, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus. Now Jesus said, you shall know the truth. If you know the truth will make you free. One thing about that we need to realize is if they never get the truth, you never be free. So, here's the point. He says, But you did not learn Christ in that way, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit. There's a philosophy out there that is taking people absolutely directly away from God, and they cannot see it. They can't see it. They're darkened in their understanding. And quite often it's because of the hardness of our hearts that we reject what God is saying. He said, and that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. There is a way for us to become like Jesus and do what we do, even if it's painful, to do what we do for the joy set before us. How do you, like Paul says, or James said, rejoice when you're faced with manifold trials in this life. Rejoice. Do it with all joy. How do you do that? How do you be happy about what you're going through? That almost sounds like an oxymoron. You can't be happy about having trouble. Can you? Can you? He says, now, therefore, what do you say therefore? For? Why would you say therefore? Isn't it because of what you've just said that you're going to say something? Isn't that why you say therefore? He says, therefore, laying aside falsehood, excuse me, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. Because why? Because the truth, when you know the truth will make you free. The truth is important. But have you ever told the truth? Have you ever told the truth with the intent to cut somebody to shreds instead of to help the situation? Gracious. I wish I could erase the first 10 years of my preaching, honestly. Because I used the truth like a sharp sword to cut people's spiritual heads off. I'm so regretful of that. I wish I had never done that. I wish I could take that back. But I can't. I can't take it back. What I can do now is speak the truth, like Paul says in this same chapter, back in, I think it's verse 15. He says, but speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth with the concept in my mind that I want to do something good with the truth. I want to do something to help with the truth. You know that A Few Good Men, Jack Nicholson, the prosecutor or the defense attorney says, we need to have the truth. You can't handle the truth. Well, sometimes we can't. Sometimes we don't know how to handle the truth. It's too hard because it cuts, it hurts like a conscience that still has the points on it. But we can't be saved without the truth. It is impossible to be saved without the truth. So he says, therefore, laying aside all falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. Husbands and wives, parents and children, neighbors, brothers in Christ. It doesn't matter. All of our relationships have to be based on the truth. But there's a key to using the truth. Sometimes people are going to get what they don't deserve with the truth. And we'll read about that in just a minute. But he says, be angry. It's impossible not to get angry. Everybody gets angry from time to time. You would be, and I heard this in a sermon one time, and I've been pondering it ever since. A wise old man, one of the few men in history that I know of that ever been able to quote the Bible from memory. He was standing up there and he said, the person who can't get angry is a worthless pile of flesh. I thought, whoa, that's a powerful statement. Would you stop and think about it? If you can't get angry about injustice, things will go literally to hell in a handbasket. You need to be able to get angry. But there's never an excuse to sin because we get angry. I mean, people are going to do things that can make us angry just for the injustice in it. But it's always our responsibility to do what's in the best interest of everyone involved. That's a tough job. But we have the best example in the world. The best example there ever was. We have our Lord Jesus to look at. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. It's not like we don't have a manual to go by. It's not like we don't have a YouTube for it. You can learn to do anything if you have the manual. He says, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. Why? Because we are members one of another. Don't you know we're joined? That's how we are one. We're not one like this. We're one like this. We are joined together on the basis of truth. But not just the truth. We're joined together on the basis of truth in love. Wanting to do the best thing for our neighbor. Wanting to do the best for each other. He says, when he says we are members one of another, then he says be angry, but don't sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Take care of business. Deal with things. Don't let them turn you bitter. Because that's so easy to do. When we don't take care of the problem, when the problem arises, he says this, don't give the devil an opportunity. That's a bad translation. Opportunity is not what it says. Well, this word right here is not opportunity, it's a dot on the map. It's a spot in your brain. It's a place for a foothold. It's a place to take root. And what will take root is the bitterness that can destroy us all. It'll destroy everything that's good. He says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. It's important that we deal with it and deal with it when it's fresh. He says, don't give the devil a place. And here he starts explaining how. Here's how you do what he's talking about doing. I want to skip past the first one. Just very briefly, I want to say something about it. If you're a thief, he says, let him who steals. What's the first order of business? Well, don't steal. Like Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Yeah, okay, well, there's a lot behind that. How do you just say no? Well, you got to have some kind of a change of thinking, a change of thought processes to make you say no to something that used to be very important in your life. So, how do you say no? I love the way Paul deals with things like this. Because it's real easy for somebody to say, don't do that. Just don't do that. You know, every time you take something out of somewhere, there's a hole there. Something's going to fill that hole. So you can't just say don't, because there's going to be a hole. There's a hole that's going to be filled with something. So what do you do? What do you do to change everything? Well, Paul says don't steal. But rather, here's what you do instead. Instead of stealing, get a job. Work hard so that you'll have something But now he says, so that you'll have something to give to him who has need. I'll tell you what, if you follow that advice right there, and you stop stealing, you get a job, and the reason you're working is so you'll have something to support yourself and to help somebody else, it's impossible for you to even think about stealing from the people that you're trying to help. It changes the whole dynamic. It's a win-win situation. You can't lose. That should, right there, and anybody who has ever done that will tell you that it changes bitterness into joy. It's a choice that we have. It's a choice of how we're going to view everything that happens to us in life. Jesus went through that on the cross, all of the shame that was directed at him. It says that he despised that shame. I want you to think about that word a little bit with me. Because despise has to do with evaluation. It has to do with how much you value this and that. What it says is that the Lord gave no value to the shame. It didn't weigh on the scale. So since it did not weigh on the scale, it did not have an effect on the way he acted, what he was willing to do. That's where forgiveness comes in. Do you realize that his dying on the cross was decided before we were ever created? Before we were ever created. When they said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Can you, in your imagination, can you picture the discussion of, well, what are we going to do if? What about that? What about this? All of these things had to be taken care of before we were ever brought into this world. And when we were brought into this world, there was already a plan. There was already a promise. There was already something that was going to take care of our shortcomings. You ever thought about how hard it would be to forgive someone if you had to do it after they did something to you? Think about that. How often are you able to think logically when you're still suffering the pain of what somebody just did to you? That's no time to be deciding how you're going to react to what they just did. That's why it's called forgiveness. It's done before the act, not after. I love Jillian for asking me to do this, asking me to teach on that, because I have a totally different view of forgiveness now, because I'll say a young lady. She was a little girl at that time. Or a big girl, getting bigger. I'm in trouble now. Anyway, I learned something from that. That is that my whole view of forgiveness had been wrong. You don't give after you're hurt. You give before you're hurt and apply it afterwards. That's what forgiveness is. Now, let's go on down to the last one. I'm running out of time here. Now, in verse 29, Paul says this. Let no unwholesome word, actually we talked about this morning, no rotting word. Rotting. You know, if we could stand back and watch with a microscope what happens when something dies. In Florida, there's a lot of stuff laying on the side of the road. Well, there is here too. Deer get hit by a car. And they're laying out there on the road. If it's in the summertime, about 2 days and it starts getting bigger. Bigger and bigger and bigger. It's swelling up. Every one of us know what's happening inside that skin. It's decomposing. It's breaking down. It's tearing down. It's being destroyed. Every cell in the carcass is changing from alive to back to dirt. It's breaking down. It's interesting that Paul uses that terminology. He says, let no tearing down, breaking down, destroying word proceed out of your mouth. That's what happens with bitterness. That's what happens with anger uncontrolled. That's what happens when we don't care about the other person. We're just trying to win. And we have a choice. It's a choice to find joy or to let bitterness take root. He says, let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth. And here's the pivot point right here. He says, but only such a word as is good for edification. Now, you have the tearing down on one side and you have the building up on the other. Which is it going to be? Here's a choice that every one of us have when we start having trouble with a neighbor, with a friend, with a brother, with a wife, with a husband, with a you pick it. Whatever the problem is, and whoever it is you're dealing with, every time it's your turn, you have a choice. What are you going to choose? Bitterness? Or are you going to choose joy? Because here's what it says. But only such a word as is good for edification, you say what is right for the occasion. Do what's right for the occasion. Do what is right to build, to fix it instead of destroy it. He says, according to the need of the moment, whatever's needed, so that it will give what they deserve. Is that what it says? It doesn't say what they deserve. It says so that it will give grace to those who hear. Grace. You know, what we're talking about is doing what's right for that other person even when they don't deserve it. That's hard in the heat of the moment if you haven't already made up your mind what you're going to do at the time. If you haven't already given that before you start this discussion. I'm telling you, folks, it would cure every problem in every neighborhood, in every household, in every... It solved the problem in Congress. It would. It would. It says, so that it will give grace to those who hear. Question is, when we're about to make the decision, it's our turn, and it's our turn to speak, what's going to come out of our mouths? Is it going to be something that fixes? Or is it going to be something that we think wins? Let me tell you, there is no winning when we don't have love behind whatever it is that we say. Speak the truth in love, caring about the results of what we're going to say. And if we do, this whole world will change. One discussion, one problem at a time. This world will change. The lesson's yours. I hope that we can get a grip on this word that we've been bantering about for so many weeks. This word love that seems so hard to get a hold of. If you're in need of obedience to the gospel, please make your life right this morning. Won't you come while we stand and sing the song that Ron has prepared for us?